And so under persecutions, they were forced to not only relinquish the Bibles, and this is something, and if you understand that Roman Catholicism is an admixture of a centuries-old culture of paganism and devil worship, mixed with Old Testament theology and just a spattering of selective New Testament terminology, then you understand that everything that Rome does has its roots in paganism.
So to really understand history and where we are today and why this nation is so great with the religious freedoms that we have to understand the bad things that have happened, the relationships that we've had in the past. And so, Dr. Alexander, if you could explain to us in a nutshell, really, the Roman Catholic Church started, and we're not here to just totally attack anybody who's ever claimed to be Roman Catholic or have had any connection with them, because, of course, all three of us, I believe, have come from those roots, and we understand that there's a lot of things that are just not understood. They're not taught. And so a lot of people are ignorant to these things, but it's very important that we would understand the beginnings of this. So basically, we have Jesus Christ starting the new church, and from that time, we have churches. Jesus Christ promised us that the church would never die. It would always bring him glory throughout the ages, throughout all ages, a world without end, amen. And so we know that there's going to be a perpetuity of the churches. And so through history, we should always be able to find that. And I believe that's what Dr. Alexander, his sole purpose in being a historian is to shed light on where those churches were or where they are found in history, because we know that Jesus says, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And we also know from distinctions in the Bible that there are harlot churches, and there's churches that have gone to teaching heresies and doctrines of devils. And we see that in Revelation chapter 17. I don't have the passage in front of me, but you can go look at it yourself. And there's going to be this religious coming together where everybody unites, and we see that with denominations and things of that nature. But basically, from the time of Jesus, where the first church started, the churches already started to go into persecution. Then we see the erection of the Roman Catholic Church in about the 300s, and from there they started to control the state. They were in connection with the state, the government, and they started to ban the Bible. They started to ban any teachings or religious practices that were against them. And so this is where we have found these churches that were from Jesus Christ being persecuted and having to actually hide. So Dr. Alexander, and maybe if you wanted to say something about this, could you just give us kind of in a nutshell what that looked like, what the churches that were hiding might have identified as, where they were located, and what this persecution looked like, as we saw with the museum today?
Well, I guess it would all begin with the fact that Christianity was birthed in persecution, and we see that with John the Baptist, with the forerunner of Christ. We see that with Stephen being stoned. We know that historically from the early church fathers and the writings of Josephus and others as to how that all the apostles pretty much were killed in a variety of different ways. Jesus Christ was put on a cross. And then we know that even John's exile to the Isle of Patmos prior to the close of the New Testament era, that Domitian and then Diocletian and Septimus Severus and Flavian and on, there were just a host. In fact, there were dozens of Roman emperors. The church went into a time of what we call imperial persecutions, and those were persecutions carried out on behalf of the state. This was before a state church existed. When the Catholic institution started, then the persecutions were placed into the hands of the religious institution, and those were carried out by the church with the armies of the government at their disposal. And one of the first examples of that is the Donatist persecutions in North Africa. And the Donatists were persecuted by Augustine. And you can read all of that in Philip Schaff's history. He brings out a lot of information concerning that and other early histories.
And now Augustine was the first, the leader of the Catholic Church when it erected?
Well, he would have been considered their great, he built the framework of it theologically. He was the one great early theologian of Catholicism. And their theological system itself, which is not to say every tenet, but the actual backbone framework of it, was put in place by Augustine in the sense that it was a dominion theology. It was a replacement theology whereby they believed that Rome replaced Israel and thereby had all the promises now that were once given to Israel now given to them as the one true, quote, Holy Mother Catholic Church. And so now because Israel was in a theocratic arrangement with God and used the armies, to go after others in a time of conquest, Catholicism now believed that they could use their armies also to further their kingdom on this earth, which was, the Roman Catholic institution, and therefore they could do much more than what the Jews ever did, and they would torture, and they would set people on fire, and they would behead them. And all of this was supposed to be in the name of God for the purpose of either forcing you into the kingdom or killing you because you would not enter the kingdom, and therefore you're a heretic and deserve to go to hell. And so then we find persecutions among the Albigenses and the Waldenses. The Waldenses were one of the earliest identifiable groups, and yet they weren't persecuted immediately. The Donatists would have probably been the most early group, other than the apostolic Christians that we read of, as far as the record goes. But all of the groups down through the ages that were outside of Rome were persecuted for being outside of Rome. And there's about 15 of them, and sometimes they go by about 15 to 18 different, we call them nomenclatures, or different identifying names. And, we could walk through all of those. But the fact is that for about 15 centuries, in a nutshell, Europe was held hostage in a stranglehold by a theology, and that theology was Catholic dominion, slaughtering theology. That is why when the reformers attempted to reform it, they still all backed in their own corner and had their own state churches, from Knox to Calvin to Zwingli, Melanchthon, and so forth. And so that is what really Catholicism was birthed in, shedding the blood of true Christians.
And so people endured this for a long time. You would think that there must have been people that were Catholic that were just thinking, is there another option? Is there, something else out there? I mean, there had to be people that were just questioning the morality of the church. I mean, unless they were protected from it. But I guess a lot of people were probably just so brainwashed that this is the truth that, seeing people burned at the stake and stuff seem normal to them, I guess.
I usually use the three examples of those in the 11th, 12th, into the 13th centuries, and that's Peter de Broys, Henry of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Arnold of Brescia. And those three men, literally, when they would go into cities sometimes to preach, they were almost across the board embraced by people who were starving for some type of a spiritual truth, and for a champion who would actually speak out because they were scared to death because they had seen all the persecutions around them. And anyway, what's interesting today is if you go to Brescia, Italy, and I've been there, they have a massive monument for Arnold, and they would not have spit on Arnold had he been on fire in their day. They actually had him put to death. And so, that's kind of one of the twisted things that Rome always does, and that is, they'll name a mountain after a saint and then force the people to worship it. They worship the relics and make others worship it. And people who hated Catholicism later, they'll make them a saint down through history. And Dowling records a lot of this in his History of Romanism. But yeah, there are a lot of people just hungry and waiting. The Dark Ages, as we mentioned, was dark because the Bible was, a forbidden book. And so if people get an opportunity, there will be those who will accept Christ. So absolutely there was those groups in there.
Also, you have to remember that down through those centuries, the Roman Catholics were killing anyone who taught against them, and all these different groups and everything. So what you have is a situation where the common people, they may question what they're being taught, they may question what's being done and everything, but if it's presented to them, a lot of them were just absolutely terrified and just would not, even consider any other opinion because of, if I listen to this person and they get caught, then they're going to come after me. And so there was a great danger in even listening to these people. So there's a lot of pressure, and the Catholic Church maintained that pressure to undermine their message. But people still listened because people are always going to listen to the truth. And so that's why they had so many converts over time.
So at some point they stopped the Bible from getting in the hands of people. Was that pretty early on? Do you have that? Maybe do you know when that first pope said?
That actually goes back into the Imperial persecutions. In fact, one of the debates surrounding the Donatists was that of, if I can remember the terminology, traitors. And so under persecutions, they were forced to not only relinquish the Bibles, and this is something, and if you understand that Roman Catholicism is an admixture of a centuries-old culture of paganism and devil worship, mixed with Old Testament theology and just a spattering of selective New Testament terminology, then you understand that everything that Rome does has its roots in paganism. So as the imperial emperors often confiscated Bibles, Rome would just do the same thing through papal edicts and such down through the years. But during the imperial persecutions, you would have to turn over your scriptures, and then you would have to actually, in the presence of one of the underlings that were sent up by the emperor, you'd have to have a sacrifice and prove that you were going to worship the ancestral gods and you were submitting to this and you were turning your back on Jesus Christ. And the question arose later, which is a controversy and too much to really get into here, those that had done that, what do you do with them then after the persecutions are over? Can you trust them? And so some of these great men that rose up, they had been attending ordinations where people who had turned in Bibles under imperial persecutions were now wanting to be ordained and ordain others to the ministry. Now, these are people understand. It's like, well, shouldn't you forgive them? Didn't Peter, deny Christ, and then wasn't he greatly used? Well, consider yourself being in that situation. You've seen your family members tortured to death, your preacher tortured to death, and not turn his Bible in. And now you have these people turning their Bibles in, and they want to enter the ministry. It would be a hard time for you being willing to sit under them at that point in time.